Hi, everybody. This is Metropolitan Nathanael joining you this Sunday evening with our special guest, Father John Chryssavgis, for our bi-weekly conversation. Today's conversation is going to focus on St. John of Sinai. As you know, the Fourth Sunday of Lent is dedicated to this, the memory of this great monastic of our church. And we have the great privilege and honor to have Father John join us and actually to lead our conversation today. Father John, welcome.
Thank you, Your Eminence.
It always feels good to speak with your old professors, and I'm really glad that I submitted all my homework and all my papers, and I don't owe you anything. And I think I did pretty well in your class.
You did more than well. No, it's an honor to be with you. I'm glad you're doing this video chat.
Well, thank you. And you, everyone out there, as you see in the Facebook page event, please do submit your questions. We'll try to get to them as best we can. I'm monitoring two screens here, so I'm not cheating on any test, Father John. I'm just kind of making sure I can get to everybody's questions as they come in. But Father, can you just tell us a little bit about St. John? Many of us, I mean, you Google search him, you'll find out information. I think, as I recall, it was one of my favorite works that we studied in seminary. And I think a lot of people tend to read his classic work during Great Lent. But tell us a little bit about the saint.
Yes, he is a popular saint. There's no question about that. And we'll talk about the book itself a little later. But just generally to introduce the saint, it's always been for me a breath of fresh air to see the church focusing on, Great Lent by the fourth week of Lent. Actually, from the third, the Sunday of the Cross. But it's almost as if the church is saying that after the Sunday of Orthodoxy, with the celebrations and the icons and the images, the visuals and so forth, which we Orthodox love and which we're very good at as well. And after the second Sunday of Lent with St. Gregory Palamas, with the profound theology that's influenced the church over the centuries, especially since the 14th century, though St. John Climacus was very influential on the theology of St. Gregory Palamas too. But it's like the church is telling us after these big events and celebrations and the profound theology where people want to sort out what's orthodox and what's heterodox or heresy, the church is saying, okay, we're planting the cross in the ground now firmly. Let's focus on the goal of the purpose of Great Lent as we head towards Holy Week, as we head towards Easter. And John Climacus in the Fourth Sunday and Mary of Egypt on the Fifth Sunday are exceptions in some ways, because here we have two monastics, one man, one woman, who close the period of Great Lent. One of them has written a book. Mary of Egypt didn't write anything. And they are the ones that the church is now bringing to our attention, bringing before our eyes. It's almost as if the church is reminding us, to try and connect this in as less a superficial way as, we possibly can, of the importance. These 5th century, 6th century, 7th century ascetics that went off to the desert learned some basic insights about life and about death, about being alone and about being in community, about suffering and about healing. It's almost as if the desert was a laboratory for them to learn some very exceptional truths about heaven and earth, and most especially about what it means to be human, which we are all intensely facing these days as we're locked up in our own homes, sheltering. So the desert fathers and mothers, John Climacus, Mary of Egypt, came to know and explore what it means to be human, profoundly human, and therefore what it means to get to know God.
Well, that's as you mentioned, it's very appropriate for what we're going through today. Most people around the world feel like they're in the desert, they're alone. We're distancing, social distancing, and staying in place. And I suppose for the ascetic fathers and mothers, this was part of the ascesis. This was part of coming closer to Christ. Involved silence and prayer and reflection and avoiding all of the distractions that we have come to kind of make part of our daily, the daily norm. In terms of, so I mentioned Saint John of Sinai. Obviously, he was a saint that lived at the monastery of Sinai, but he's also known as John Climacus because of the work that he wrote, the Ladder of Divine Ascent. Just in a nutshell, can you tell us what is at the core of his teaching in that book?
So it's the powerful image of the ladder that really captures everyone's attention and the interest, and in the images, the icons that we have of the ladder, they're very powerful.
The little angels helping you and the saints helping you and the devil's trying to pull you down and so forth, dragging you down.
Very powerful images. So there's no question. The image of the ladder is an Old Testament image, of course, with Jacob, but St. John Climacus really captures this image with his book. We don't know too much about his life, actually. We know that he arrived on Mount Sinai at the very tender age of about 16 in the maybe early 7th century or late 6th. He was educated. He had been to school. He was totally unlettered. But he entered monasticism at the age of 16. He was tonsured, he entered Sinai. He was tonsured at the age of 20 and lived with his elder. Then he lived as a hermit for 35 years. So he was an experienced counselor, spiritual father, with receiving numerous visitors to his cell. And then after about 40 years, 5 years with his elder, 35 years in isolation, after 40 years he was invited by the monks of the monastery to become the abbot of St. Catherine's monastery. And he would have educated the monks, and probably the ladder was originally addressed to the monks as their way of climbing the ladder of the spiritual stages, if you like, of the Christian life. Originally, actually, the book was called Spiritual Tablets, after the tablets that Moses received at the mountain that's just above the monastery and literally overwhelms the monastery in Sinai. But the image and the name that prevailed was the ladder. There are 30 steps from...
and 30 is a very popular number in the church.
Exactly.
Right?
30 itself is it symbolizes the maturity of Christ. So here we are, leading towards maturity. So 30 steps and a little treatise at the end, a letter to the shepherd, that is a kind of a book of advice on how to advise your spiritual disciples. But something that's very important for John Climacus and for the monks and nuns of his time is that he understood that he wasn't just addressing monks. He was also addressing lay people. For him, salvation is not the monopoly of monasticism. For him, the Christian life is an invitation to pilgrimage, an invitation to climb the ladder from the first step of renunciation, learning to let go of things, again, the sort of thing we're learning as we shelter in place, to the 30th step, which is love. And that's the supreme step for St. John Climacus. It is above silence, it is above prayer, it is above discernment, it is above humility. Love is above all else, and divine love for St. John, is a passionate love for God. He says, blessed is the one who yearns so much for God as a mad lover does for his beloved. So love is the ultimate goal for St. John.
So, Father John, you said something that I think, I don't know if others caught it, but St. John knew who he was writing to. Obviously, his immediate audience was his immediate flock, the monks that he was taking care of. But the treatise is meant to be available or accessible to anyone. I mean, we're reading it today in the 21st century, right? For laymen and women in the world. And I don't know how many times I've heard people speak about salvation or spirituality being the monopoly of the monastics, of always turning to the monasteries or to the monastics as the bearers of orthodoxy. And clearly St. John knew that this is not necessarily the case. That's why he's writing to all people to try to climb that ladder. We all have to climb that ladder, and we all have to take each of these steps. And obviously there are holy nuns and monks and priests, but there are also countless holy men and women and children in the world. But if in the 21st century, how do we apply this? I mean, how do we take, what is the takeaway for someone living in the 21st century, in our case here, I mean, in particular Chicago, but the United States, but all over the world? How do we understand the text today?
So the Ladder does provide some insights into how we ought to be leading the Christian life and how spiritual guides ought to be directing their spiritual disciples. And it's not as easy as we tend to think, that if someone's an abbot in a monastery, they're all of a sudden a spiritual father. Or if someone's a monastic, they're all of a sudden, as you mentioned, have some sort of precedence in the kingdom of heaven. That's not how the Ladder sort of appears, at least in my reading. I was thinking just yesterday, in thinking about this program, listening to Dr. Fauci, the epidemiologist. And, in medicine, there's a science to all this. The diagnosis is done by scientists, by doctors, not by those who claim to know some sort of popular medicine, not by those who claim to deny or, accept popular maybe science. It's the same thing in spirituality. It's not arbitrary. There's a science to it. And St. John Climacus, first of all, comes across as one, but he also says that the spiritual elder should be a doctor, should know when to cut, know how deeply to cut. Sometimes it'll hurt. Sometimes it'll be uncomfortable. Sometimes you'll be more compassionate. Sometimes you'll be more lenient. But in offering, I think, advice to people, there are two images in particular, because there are a lot of things that John talks about. Obviously, each of the steps of the ladder could be talked about here. But I thought in particular in this, strange time that we are living right now, the image of the monastic, the monk or the nun in the cell, in the monastic cell, is something that reminds me very strongly of the mandate to remain in shelter. Because in the cell, the monastic on Sinai, or we here today, have a battleground, have a spiritual warfare. It's actually hard to live with yourself and hard to live with others. And learning to be with ourselves awakens us from numbness to the world around us. It opens up even the numbness, the dullness of our vision. When I go for walks and it's totally quiet outside, there is no one out, you notice things differently. You
notice things about yourself too.
And yourself too. And so that's the first thing, that it's actually important to sit alone and not want to hold on to crutches. And the crutches could be going to a service. You know, many of us feel better about going to services. What happens when you don't have a service? Can you still communicate with God? Can you still be silent with yourself? Can you still care about other people? So the cell is the first thing. The second thing I would, I think, mention that comes to me as we go through these days of self-isolation is the power of silence. St. John has a lot to say about silence and prayer. And he was, as I said, very, very influential on the fathers of the Philokalia. And in fact, on all monasticism. You know, you said that this is a text that is read usually during Lent. In monasteries, it's read not only by the monks in their cells on Mount Athos, for instance, but also aloud in their refectory, in the dining hall.
While they're reading, yeah.
So that means that a monk on Mount Athos, take a monk who's 80 years old, who went to the monastery at the age of 30. He has read the ladder, even if he didn't want to, at least 50 times. And he's heard it in the dining room at least 50 times. That impacts on the silence through the centuries. So what is silence, though? Again, silence for me, and the way St. John speaks about it, is a way of noticing things that you would normally ignore, a way of waiting and watching things going on in your heart and in the world around us. It's not just shutting up. It's actually the glue between the words that we speak. It's what binds us to our actions, ultimately, and to our relationships. So it's not aloneness, it's not solitude. Silence is actually a key factor in solidarity and communion. In silence, we actually learn, like St. Paul says, that if one member suffers, all suffer together with it. That's exactly what we're learning today. That we're all mutually independent, that the whole globe is interconnected. So when you stop doing things because you can't do them any longer, and I would say even clergy, what if clergy were told by their Metropolitan that, you know what, we're having one liturgy in our metropolis? Would the clergy know what to do if they didn't have church services? I don't know. But when you stop doing, you begin being. When you stop speaking out of the side of your mouth, let's say, you care more. And that, I think, is a basic teaching from the ladder.
So the opposite of silence for St. John is what? I mean, in one word. Because, I mean, you obviously described it, but I'm trying to capture the word.
Indifference. Indifference. And it's actually followed by the run of indifference. Anesthesia, he says, where you literally feel nothing about anyone or anything.
And that's very interesting because, Father, today with social media, people speak, but they often speak with indifference. I mean, they don't care how it's going to affect the person who's reading it. They don't care how broad their reach is. And it's actually, wow, that's amazing. From the 7th century to the 1st century.
I would say that, wouldn't it be great for someone who blogs constantly criticizing others to just step back and for 40 days try not to criticize others? See how that works. Because I think it'll go a long way. See, and this affects Your Eminence, this affects everyone. That's another thing that ascesis or the desert does. When you're in the desert, you can't show off. You're surviving in the desert. You can't take the things that make you feel happy, like your radio or some favorite novels. You can't carry too much in the desert. It's the essentials. It's survival mode. Because like the virus almost, it's an equalizer. The desert reminds us all that we are mortal, that we are all fallen, that no one is immune. Even those of us that go to church, we're immune to exactly the same vulnerability. the same sensitivity, the same mortality, the same possibility of losing it all. Asymptomatic. We are spiritually asymptomatic if we're in church, but we're still sinful.
Absolutely. I think that's an incredible insight, Father. I have heard some comments out there saying, "Oh, the Orthodox don't get sick. We don't get sick in the church," kind of making the church into this kind of safe zone, a magical space. Once you walk in, you're no longer vulnerable to anything. I mean, and we could take it beyond the virus, saying if you're in church now, you are immune to sin as well. As you said, there's some people that have commented on clergy of other churches who are sick and saying, well, they're sick because they're not Orthodox. You know, they got sick because they were in their church. They weren't in our church.
Maybe let's time to stop all of those sort of comments. You know, you mentioned as we were preparing for this a couple of days ago, you said to me, you know, what does a book entitled, you know, The Ladder of Perfection, how can you relate that to, you know, everyday people who are anything but perfect? Well, here's the thing again. The desert teaches people like John Climacus, and that's why he's compassionate. You expect him to be strict, but he's compassionate because he's learned that perfection is God's alone. He is inevitably going to be imperfect. And this virus, again, has reminded us of our imperfection, of the fact that we are vulnerable. If you want to come really nice and polished out of this coronavirus crisis, all you have to think about is death, some of the nursing homes, some of the hospitals. There's hardly a sense of perfection in those places. We're all sort of not immune to this.
Father John, in terms of our journey to perfection, holiness, if we could use that word, how do we understand mistakes and falling? You know, I kind of see myself on a ladder that's, 30 feet high. I don't want to fall off because if I fall off, I'll probably break my neck. But I mean, the truth is that icon, the very famous icon of the ladder, I mean, we almost, at least for me, when I used to see it as a seminarian, I used to think, okay, how do I get from step 1 to 30 without falling? Because if I fall, then I'm going to fall. There's that little monster on the bottom, the devil, who's ready to eat you up if you fall. But the truth is, I don't know that I've ever climbed the ladder and I haven't fallen, and I don't know, even in the spiritual, my own struggles, that I always fall. But how do we understand the road to perfection and perfection and not making mistakes?
I'm scared of heights, so well, John actually says, the higher up you fall, the higher up you go, the harder the fall will be as well. But he would not, in his age, in the 7th century, think of the ladder as a kind of an escalator. So you don't get to the top and there are the first.
It would be easy if it's an escalator. You don't have to do anything because it takes you up.
Exactly. So he actually says you could be on the 30th step and still be working on the first. So it's not like you leave one behind and you move to the other. And for him, the biggest test is not judging yourself. We've talked about not judging others by your silence. Not judging yourself is exactly what, for him, the virtue of obedience is. You trust in someone else because you might actually be a harsher judge of yourself. When you're not sort of trusting your way of doing things, your will, your whim, whatever you feel gets you high in this world, and it might be going to church, and it might be wrong for you. Maybe you need to look at why you want to go to church and how you feel when that happens. So becoming dependent, a spiritual healthy dependence on others, which he would translate as bearing one another's burdens, that's the big test for what rung you're on on the ladder.
That's amazing. I feel like I'm back in class, Father John. It's great. This is continuing education for the clergy. I just, again, we have a few minutes, but if anyone would like to ask Father John a question, so far everyone is silent because they're taking it all in, Father. They're sending you greetings from Australia, from all over the world. We've got some people from Paris joining us. So Australia, maybe your dad. I don't know.
It could be my dad.
But it could be your dad. It could be, yeah. But if anyone has a question, please type away. The last point you made about being harsh on yourself. I remember encountering a seminarian who was being harsh on himself. And I asked, why are you doing this? Why, and it wasn't something that his spiritual father told him to do. It wasn't, direction from anyone, but he said, well, I have to do this so that I don't sin. And I said, well, isn't this the beauty of being in the church? The beauty about the church and the why we're in the church is because when we sin, not if we sin, but when we sin, we're there, we're in the hospital, there are physicians, we have people around us who care, who will pick us up and not leave us along, on the road to die, like in the parable of the Good Samaritan. That's the church. Mm-hmm. And so by himself, his own, I don't know if it's the ego or not being obedient and not putting his own needs aside, he was actually hurting himself. I thank you, Father John. We don't have any questions, so I'm gonna just thank you very, very much. I know you've been working on a lot of different projects. You work extremely hard for our archdiocese. Of course, you're the theologian of the Department of Inter-Orthodox Ecumenical and Interfaith Relations, and we've worked together for so many years. And you also work for His All Holiness at the Ecumenical Patriarchate. And we have His All Holiness in our prayers and all the fathers and our brothers and sisters in Constantinople. But I think you've been working on, you and others have been working on a very important project that has recently been announced. Can you just share a little bit about that?
So yes, Your Eminence, anyone listening can see this document on the website of the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of America. And you were personally involved in the early stages and supportive throughout the work of this commission that was basically called by the Patriarch to put together a statement on the role and the responsibility of Orthodox Christians in a world with very specific and very challenging social issues. Issues such as health, issues such as economy, issues such as politics, issues such as interfaith dialogue, issues such as immigration and so forth, marriage and sexuality. And the commission of 12 people, men and women, clergy and laity, put together a document, a substantial document that's online at the moment and will be published next month by Holy Cross, basically expressing or extending the experience of the ecumenical patriarchate over the centuries, and especially in more recent times, on these issues. Because I think our church has, precisely because of its connection with the diaspora and its churches and the eparchies throughout the world, has a unique perspective, and I would say a very positive, constructive perspective on how to deal with these issues. So the text is just out. It took 3 years to produce and go through various stages. One of the stages was that the Patriarch himself contacted all of the eparchies of the throne for input on the social issues and challenges that they face in their own dioceses and archdioceses. And a whole host of bishops, I would say for the first time, so passionately responded to this patriarchal request. And so we had input from the dioceses and input from leading theologians, monastics, and hierarchs as well, and produced a document that is a conversation starter. It's not doctrine. It's not expected to be doctrine, and it's not expected to be the final word. But as Orthodox, we're normally afraid to delve into these issues. The minute you say something, you must be on one side of the political spectrum. You must be for or against this particular issue. And of course, people go straight to the doctrine and look up abortion and look up homosexuality. These are the only interests that people have in the world, a world that's literally being massacred by this virus. But usually we've said we don't have a social position, which I don't think is the right thing. If you look at the early fathers, St. John Chrysostom, he definitely had a clear social position on issues. Or we say this is a matter between each individual and his or her spiritual father. It doesn't quite work in the 21st century when many of our faithful and parishioners are far more informed and far more affected by these issues than their spiritual elders. So we put together a document that was, scrutinized by the Holy Synod and finally endorsed. And we're hoping, as I say, that this will be a tool in parishes and in communities, in families, to discuss some of these issues.
So what's the actual title, Father, so that they can look it up, Google search it? Is it the social ethos?
For the life of the world, toward a social ethos of the Orthodox Church.
So I think the key word there is toward, right? It's not the social ethos, but we're working on establishing an ethos.
Exactly.
So everyone, please look that up, study it, and to the clergy, I highly recommend for the fathers of our metropolis to utilize it in their teachings. And we will be talking about it in the weeks ahead. So everyone, thank you very much for joining us. Father John, it's been a great honor. And you brought me back to seminary, and you've shown how much I still have to learn. And we will be back again this coming Wednesday at 5 p.m. and we'll be discussing a very important matter that's affecting most people, and that's anxiety, especially in light of all of the differences, the silence that we now face, and how new and fresh it is, and the pressures, and how scared we are, and how anxious we've become. So everyone join us on Wednesday for a great conversation with Dr. Rhonda Anderson on anxiety and the coronavirus.
Yeah,
thank you very much.
I wanted to say, Your Eminence, thank you very much, and thank you again for doing this. I don't want to patronize you, but it's exactly the sort of thing that our churches should be doing, working and thinking outside of the box, and really grateful for what you do.
Thank you, Father. Thank you. A lot of the fathers out there are working very hard and doing very similar things. So Thank you. Thank you for your good words.
Thank you. Bye.